video we looked at the rectangular marquee tool, the elliptical marquee tool, as a way of selecting large areas of our image. What I want to do now is to look at some other methods of selection. First thing I want to look at is just below here, the lasso tool. The lasso tool is a fairly crude tool, and I'm just dragging round an area to select, and if I copy and paste that, you can see that I've produced obviously a rough selection. Now once I've produced that rough selection, I could of course clean up this edge. I could use my rubber here, and if I hold the shift key down when I use the rubber and move to another location, I can draw some straight lines. Now the nature of the edge is obviously dependent on what kind of setting I've set the brush. Let me just go back through my history there and just undo some of those various eraser marks. So the eraser can be looked at in different ways, and if we look here, I can have an eraser as a block or as a pencil or as a brush. If I keep it as a block, you can see I've got a sort of solid block, and if I click, hold the shift key down, move to another location and click again, you'll see this time that my edge is really crisp. I keep my finger down on the shift key and continue to erase, and then I can freely erase that area there. I can select that part of the image. The lasso tool, again, I could kind of try to carefully draw around this area, but it's not so easy. Let's deselect, that's Command and D for the moment. Let's go back to my layers panel and let's switch both layers back on, and let's just delete this top layer. So underneath the layers, underneath the selection tool, which is the lasso tool, there's some other selection tools. For instance, there's the polygonal lasso tool. Now the polygonal lasso tool works like this. If I click and move to another location and click again, and then move to another location and click again, and then move to another location and click again, click, click, and then come back to the beginning where I started, you'll see just now there's a little tiny 0 that appears, which tells you that you've completed a kind of complete loop. Now I've selected this particular area. If I copy and paste that, if we now look at that area, you can see I've selected that much more crisply. Let's say I want to select the layer beneath that. If I go click, 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 and back, if I go copy and paste, what's happened there? Well, let's just look what we've done. We've actually selected this layer. I switch off the background. You can see that I've only actually selected a part of this layer, and that's the only part that's been copied across. And usually when we go copy and paste, the selection that's been copied is sent right to the middle of the document. So I didn't want that to happen really. What I wanted to do was to select the colour beneath it. So let's go back to my history menu and let's just delete that and go back to my selection. Really the mistake that I made there was I was in the wrong layer. So if I come back to the background layer and now click copy and paste, what you'll see this time is that I've now selected this particular area. Of course, I've also selected this part here. Photoshop isn't recognizing that this is an area that is, one piece of paper. It's just seeing it as a zone of color. If I wanted to get rid of this, okay, what I can do now is I can flood that area with color. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to the polygonal lasso tool, click and drag over this area, including some of the background, until I've completed my loop. There's the 0. And I'm going to go to the paint bucket tool. Now when you select the paint bucket tool, you can see I've got a number of different options here. I've got the foreground color, I've got the mode, okay, and it would be really useful to be able to select the colour that's in this area here. So before I do that, I'm going to just change to the eyedropper tool, and I'm going to click on here, and you can now see over here the colour is this colour. If I now come back to the paint bucket tool and click select, you can see that certain areas of the image are being filled. Now what happens with the paint bucket tool is the paint bucket tool again has a series of different settings. One of those is to do with opacity, so you can see the opacity of my tool at the moment is only 76%. If I make that 100%, then that's going to be much more the colour that I've got over here. Tolerance. The tolerance setting means how many pixels that are the same colour are being flooded. If I create a much higher figure for that, and then use the paint bucket tool, more areas will be filled. What I could do, of course, is I could add a new layer, and then if I use the paint bucket tool, I've created a solid area. It's not quite blended in there, but at the moment that's now giving me a sort of solid area colour. If I now deselect, that's a closer match to what I've got behind. Now I can start to put my layers back. I could do something about that by sort of softening the transition between the two a bit later on, but for the moment that shows you how the polygonal lasso tool works as opposed to the normal lasso tool. Now there's another way of selecting as well. Again, I'm going to just delete some of these other layers just so I'm dealing with that first primary layer. Rather like the paint bucket tool, which works on the idea of tolerance, the Magic Wand tool also works in a similar way. If I click on an area, it's basically selecting all the pixels that are roughly the same colour. Up here it says 65, so imagine the idea of 65 variations of pixel which are roughly the same colour. Up here it says contiguous. This means that all the pixels that are roughly the same colour are going to be selected. If I uncheck that, deselect that area for the moment, and then click again, what you'll now see is that the pixels that are this colour and over here are being selected. Some colour over here is also being selected, and that means that the pixels variation, the tolerance setting, is probably a little bit on the high side. If I deselect, change that figure to a lower figure, and then click on here, you can see that not all of this area has been selected. If I now change that figure again to a higher setting, deselect, and then hit select, again that's a much crisper result, only choosing some of the colours up here. If I now copy and paste that, switch the background off, you can see that I've copied that area into my image too. If I finally remove that layer, there's one other option I've got for selection which is also really useful, and you'll find that underneath the Magic Wand tool. That's the quick selection tool. If I hover over this area, it's basically doing something very, very similar to the Magic Wand. It's very quickly selecting that area. If I hold the Shift key down and continue, it's also selected that area. If I hold the Shift key down again, it's also going to quickly select that area. If I now copy and paste that, you can see that I've selected some of those areas. Again, I could use the tool setting, the quick selection tool to select a particular area, and I could press backspace, which is delete, if I wanted to get rid of a particular area. So that's really simple selection using the magnetic lasso tool. It's something we haven't talked about yet. I'll finally talk about that now, which is just underneath here. I'll just delete this final layer back to take us back to this position. So what's the magnetic lasso tool? Well, the magnetic lasso tool works a bit like the selection tool, the quick selection tool, in that it tries to find an edge. So as I hover over this line, it's finding that edge of colour. As I come round, a bit like the polygonal lasso tool, I've got to do this fairly carefully, otherwise I'm going to select more areas than I need to. But once I get back to the end, it will form a 0, in which case I can then copy and paste that. If I now switch that off, you can see where I just strayed off of that edge a little bit. So the lasso tool, the polygonal lasso tool, the magnetic lasso tool, the magic wand and the quick selection tool. The most important tools to really understand how you make selections of an image area in Photoshop.